Well, hello, my name's Andy Tidy and welcome to this first series of Canal Hunter. This episode really is something of an introduction, so you know a bit about me and a bit about where this series is going. Helen, my wife, and I, we spend our summers travelling around the canal network in our narrowboat wandering bark, and behind us we tow the jam butty. We make and we sell preserves. We're based on the BCN, pretty much as far north as you can get. We're at Longwood, which is at the very end of the Doe End Canal, just between Walsall and Aldridge. The thing that's always struck me as I've travelled around the BCN since I was about 8 or 9 was the number of old bridges and blocked up holes where the canals used to go. I've always wondered what lies beyond them. In most cases, it's just an old basin. They used to be absolutely everywhere. They're as common as a car park at the back of an industrial site today. But for some of them, they're the entrance to an old arm or an old connecting canal which has since been lost. Of course, everybody knows there's about 100 miles of canals in and around Birmingham. But once upon a time, there used to be much more, about 160 miles. And I've always wondered where the other 60 miles are and what they look like. Well, a few years ago, I came across a book by a guy called Richard Chester Brown. And back in the 1970s, when he was a student in Birmingham, he went out and did a survey of all the lost bits. And he did a book on the subject, which is called The Other 60 Miles. And it's the other 60 miles that I want to go and revisit. At the time that Richard wrote the book, most of the canals were still kind of there. But these days, most of them have disappeared, but their fingerprint remains on the landscape. So my objective is, let's go and have a look and see what remains. The problem is it's a huge network, and where do you start? And I thought a good starting place is always the beginning. So we'll start off by looking at the old Birmingham Canal. That's the canal that Brindley first made in 1768, which went all the way from central Birmingham, across Smethwick Hill and out to the coal mines around Gold's Hill, Balls Hill and around what today we know as West Bromwich. Off this old canal there's lots of bits which have been lost. Some of it down to mining subsidence, some of it because it was cut off by the later Telford Canal. But we'll go and explore that in future episodes. But before we go off and start to explore the canals, I thought it'd be a good idea to have a bit of a context for it. Birmingham was always an innovative city. Lots of the artisans were great at making metal trinkets, toys, small little bits and pieces. But the prosperity of Birmingham grew, and so did the need to make heavy stuff for the Industrial Revolution. Birmingham was ideally suited because they had the right sort of skilled labour, but they needed power, they needed coal, and there was no coal in Birmingham, but there was just over the hill. So they built the canal, and the canal led into the coalfields, and the coalfields were part of the Black Country. There's much debate about where the Black Country actually extends to, but in my book, the Black Country accurately reflects the coal measures that were beneath. And underneath the Black Country there was masses of coal, and it was very close to the surface. 3 layers. There was thick, broach and heathen, and in some places you pretty much just scooped off the grass and dug the stuff up. Look at the old maps, you find a sea for every colliery, and there are seas absolutely everywhere, and they just dug down little shafts and opened up a bit underneath it and then dug the next one, but they are absolutely everywhere. And the canals were built to get the coal away from the collieries to the foundries, to get to the brickworks and to move the bricks, to get them to the ironworks and to move the iron. So the canal infrastructure was absolutely critical to the development of the Black Country and basically the start of the Industrial Revolution. Why am I starting here? Well, I'm starting here because this is where we moor for the winter. This is Longwood Boat Club. It's at the end of the Doe End Canal, which is a 5-mile branch from the Worley and Essington, coming up from Brown Hills on one side, and the Rushall Canal disappears down in the other direction, joining up with the Tame Valley. Interesting because this is where I start. Interesting because this is the edge of the Black Country. And interesting because where I'm actually moored is the start of a little stub end canal with its own lost section. This should give you a taster for some of these little lost nooks and crannies, and you'll see loads more of them as the series progresses. I'll also take you across to Walsall Wood, where you can see one of the reproduction of the old pitheads, and also a classic example of an area where coal mining subsidence has played havoc with the line of the canal. And there's some pretty good artefacts around beside the canal if you know what to look for. So, first of all, let's go to the end of the Hayhead Arm and see what's there, and we'll move on beyond. Here we are at the bottom of the Hayhead Arm. Looking back towards the main canal, you can see with boats moored on either side, as the gap through is very narrow, barely 7 foot in places. If we turn around the other way, you can see the very tail end of the Hayhead Arm. This was completely silted up and full of reeds until the 1960s, when the members dug it all out and turned it into moorings. Today, home to a small boat club with about 30 boats. As you can see, there's no turning place down here, so it's strictly one way in, one way out. So if you come in forwards, you go out backwards. If you come in backwards, you go out forwards. This is the very end. There's Journey's End. This is the site of the old Longwood Lane Bridge, which was dropped in the 1930s for a road extension. All that remains of the connection through to the rest of the Hayhead Arm is that pipe underground. Right now there's no water flowing through it, but in times of rain it flows like billy-o. And it's the other side of the road that we're going to go and take a quick look at. And there's the overflow drain, which we saw the other end of back in the moorings. Here we are on the other side of Longmoor Lane, and this is where the canal continues through that pipe and is now coming on into the Hayhead limestone works. From that rather uninspiring start as we came underneath the road bridge, suddenly the canal gets under the trees and it really starts to widen out. So by the time you reach about 100 yards into the park, you've got the full dimensions of the canal. It's about 25 feet wide. Certainly hasn't got an awful lot of depth to it, maybe a foot or 18 inches. But with the leaves gone in the winter, you can really see that this was a man-made cutting. So it was up here that the old narrowboats were brought to load themselves up with the limestone from the hills above. If you look into the distance beyond, you can see that the canal is built up on the side of a hill and the ground falls away probably 15 feet beyond, so it's held in by an embankment built in the late 1700s. If we come around a little bit further, you start to see the most interesting feature of this lost arm. When the narrowboats were brought up here to load up with limestone, they had their own finger wharf, quite a broad area of open water these days. So I'll work my way around to the end of the basin. Here you can see it on its full extent, fairly weeded up in the margins. I'm actually kind of hovering or standing on part of the basin which has been allowed to decay and fill in. But this little site is owned by Walsall Council. It's good to come and have a look at these places in the winter time, because with all the leaves dropped off the trees, you can see so much more. So here's the main width of the basin, which would hold several narrowboats side by side. The old overflow, which runs across into the valley away behind me and down through the Rushall Locks. Difficult to give you a real appreciation of the scale of this canal, but we're talking about half a mile of lost canal up here, still in water. In fact, I suspect there's probably more depth than one or two bits of the navigable sections. If a canal has got to end its days, it's not a bad way for it to end. The Hayhead Arm, left in quiet seclusion for 100 years. And here we come to the end of the navigation. The canal line continued on for a few hundred yards up the valley, and just here to my left there were entrances into the mines. There's still mine entrances in there, so I'm not going to stomp into the undergrowth too far. Behind me you see one of the last built remains, built out of Aldridge blues. The Hayhead Works was a pretty major concern. It employed about 40 people. About 20 of them worked underground, 20 of them worked above, and they would have been connected with lines of tramways running up the valley. And some of these quarries are pretty deep. But the Hayhead quarry wasn't the only one. up the line of the canal through this area, there was a really well exposed area of limestone. And there are about 4 other quarry works working down the valley. And if you look on the old maps for the area, you'll see all sorts of disused remnants from the limestone industry. But it wasn't just limestone. The area was also rich in coal. So pits were dug all the way down from here to Brown Hills, and the canal was deepened in and widened in areas so that extra loads could be carried back to the Worley and Essington and back to the furnaces out near Pelsall. And where you find coal, you also tend to find clay. And the clay here was a really good mix used to make strong bricks, almost engineering quality bricks. A bit like this pillar here behind me, made out of Aldridge blues. My house is made out of the same things, almost impossible to drill into, but also very durable. Aldridge blues, absolutely perfect for the tough environment of a canal bank and lock sides. Aldridge, for all of its rural charm now these days, was actually one of the most devastated areas in the Industrial Revolution. It was scarred by huge clay pits, coal mines, slag heaps. The place was absolutely devastated and under a pall of smoke coming over from the Black Country. What a difference a century makes. So as we draw this introduction to the lost sections of the Birmingham canals to a conclusion, I thought I'd bring you here to Walsall Wood, because one of the questions is, why do these sections get lost? They're not lost due to a lack of interest, although that's part of it. Mostly they're down to the extraction of coal. So we're here in Walsall Wood, about 3 miles to the north of Aldridge, and we're here standing at the site of the old Walsall Wood colliery. This pithead gear is a reproduction built in 2010, but there was a colliery here through until 1964. This area has a long history of coal mining. As I said, the coal wasn't very deep underground, and these small pitheads were all over the place. It's said that at the heel of every successful canal there was coal, and that's pretty true. It was the major commodity to be shipped around on the canal network. But that comes with a problem. Ever keen to extract the coal from the ground, they dug the coal mines out from the pithead, and that included going under the canal. And therefore, the canal tended to sink. And nowhere is that more apparent than here in Walsall Wood. The old coal mines were held up with pit props made out of tree trunks. As these collapsed and gave way when the colliery was finished, so the land above fell down. And of course, the canal doesn't like changes in land height, so the canal had to be built up and up and up if it was to be kept functional. This is the formidable approach to Blackcock Bridge, just a few hundred yards away from Walsall Wood Colliery. It's insanely steep. It obviously crosses the canal, but of course the truth is the land here has subsided, which is what has caused this enormous great hump, so the bridge has been built up. I like to try and show the canals in a dynamic way, and in terms of mining subsidence, this is probably the best place I can bring you to show you the problems of coal mining and the canals. If we look down here, about knee height on the towpath, there is an end of a bridge roller. But as you can see, it doesn't stretch up to the top of the bridge. It's about 3 feet down. If we cross around to the other side, you'll find a matching pair. The roller was there to protect the brickwork from the friction of the old ropes. There used to be a wooden roller in this one. You can see there were times when the roller wasn't there and the ropes still scoured their way down through the metal. But the interesting thing isn't the presence of the old roller, it's this gap up here. Why is the roller so insanely low? The answer to this, excuse all the hoots, it's incessant here. You can't come to Blackcock Bridge without the hooting going on, is these holes. These are holes for bottle jacks. And the idea is that every time that the canal subsides, you put your jacks in here, press against the beam on the top, which looks like an oversized railway sleeper, and you lift the bridge up and you insert some more bricks. If you look carefully further down, you can see the outlines of old bottle jack points. One there, waiting to be used. One there, filled in. If you look across the canal on the other side, it's possibly a better example. There's the new bottle jack points, ones waiting to be used, with the old set blocked up beneath it. And beneath the waterline, there's another set. I have no idea how many times this bridge has been jacked up. I rather suspect it goes down for about 20 feet. It's not the only clue. This water main would have been cut across the canal at the height of those little brick piers. But of course, as the bridge subsided, the pipe was in the way, so they had to jack the pipe up, cantilever it over the top, and then back down again. Top bridges are classic for the coal mining areas. They put a humpback bridge in where it's going to remain stable, but where you know that there's likely to be subsidence, the canal owners tended to put in these flat top bridges so they could do exactly what they've done here. One final curious fact about the area: the subsidence was so bad that they had to keep building up the embankments higher and higher, and boats that have come through here with depth sounders on tell me that the water through here is 10 to 12 feet deep, and that's after they brought the ash back from the power station in Walsall and dumped it in the bottom of the canal to stop it getting too deep. So all over Birmingham and the Black Country, coal mining and the canals coexisted. The canals were built, the coal was extracted and moved away by boats. The canals sank down as the land sank down. In many cases it was saved and they continued to use it, as they did here on the Doe End Canal. In other places, when the coal was worked out, there was no purpose for the canal anymore, and the resulting canal bed then sank down and it was just blocked off and left and abandoned. And that's the reason why we have so many abandoned sections. Some were abandoned for a lack of need. Some were abandoned because they subsided. So I'll leave you with Blackcock Bridge. I trust you found this introduction to the lost sections of the Birmingham canals interesting. In the next episode we will move on to Birmingham, and we will be looking at the lost basins in central Birmingham. And then we'll be following the line of the old Birmingham Canal as built by Brindley all the way through to West Bromwich.